1967. The war in Vietnam had been going on for years. American commanders promised progress. Washington promised victory. And the soldiers, they just tried to survive. But 1967 was different. This was the year the North Vietnamese decided to bleed America dry. Not by winning battles, but by making every inch of Vietnamese soil cost more than America was willing to pay. Nowhere was that more brutal than along the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, a strip of land that was anything but demilitarized. Here in the shadow of the North Vietnamese border, American Marines fought some of the most savage, forgotten battles of the entire war. Con Thien, Operation Buffalo, Operation Hickory, Operation Swift. Hill 488, names that most Americans have never heard, battles that never made the history books, men who gave everything and came home to a country that had already moved on. This is the story of 1967, America's bloodiest year along the DMZ, and the Marines who held the line. In the year 1967, deep in the jungles of Vietnam, U.S. Marines fought one of the most brutal and relentless battles of the war, Operation Kingfisher. This operation, fought near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was a deadly clash between the United States Marine Corps, USMC, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. It was a fight for survival, a fight for territory, and a fight that would leave a lasting mark on history. The Vietnam War was not just about battles, it was about the men who fought them. The Marines who endured the hell of Con Thien faced not only the enemy, but also constant artillery bombardment, deadly ambushes, and the unforgiving jungle terrain. Many never made it home. To all the veterans who served in Vietnam, we honor and thank you for your bravery and sacrifice. Your courage will never be forgotten. If you love history, if you respect the sacrifices made by those who served, then hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us tell the stories of these incredible battles and ensures that their legacy lives on. Stay with us as we take a deep dive into one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the Vietnam War, Operation Kingfisher. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of war. Let's begin. To understand Operation Kingfisher, we first need to understand the battlefield. The Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was supposed to be a buffer zone separating North and South Vietnam. But in reality, it was one of the most dangerous places in the entire war. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, used the area to launch attacks into the south, while U.S. forces, mainly the United States Marine Corps, or USMC, tried to stop them. At the heart of this deadly battleground stood Con Thien, a small but heavily fortified U.S. Marine outpost. Con Thien was meant to be an early warning base, a way to stop the NVA from pushing south. But in reality, it became a living nightmare for the Marines stationed there. The outpost was constantly bombarded with artillery, mortars, and rocket fire. Marines nicknamed it the meat grinder, because that's exactly what it was. The U.S. strategy was simple. Find the enemy, engage them, destroy them. Marines conducted search and destroy missions deep into enemy territory. But this was risky. The NVA knew the terrain better, used booby traps, ambushes, and hidden bunkers to their advantage, and often lured Marines into deadly traps. By mid-1967, U.S. commanders saw that the NVA was massing troops for a major offensive near the DMZ. In response, they launched Operation Kingfisher, a large-scale offensive meant to hit the enemy hard and push them back before they could strike first. What followed was one of the most brutal battles of the Vietnam War. The Marines had their orders. The NVA had their plan. And in the jungles of Vietnam, a deadly showdown was about to begin. By mid-1967, the U.S. military knew something big was coming. North Vietnamese forces were massing near the DMZ, bringing in thousands of troops, heavy weapons, and artillery. Intelligence reports showed that the NVA was preparing for a major offensive, one that could threaten U.S. bases and even push deeper into South Vietnam. The Marines couldn't wait for the enemy to strike first. They had to take the fight to the NVA. That's when U.S. commanders launched Operation Kingfisher. The goal? Engage and destroy the enemy before they could attack. The operation was planned as a large-scale sweep, targeting enemy positions around Con Thien and the surrounding jungle. The 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 2/4, and other Marine units would move into NVA territory, hunt down their forces, and wipe them out. But this was no simple mission. The NVA had been preparing for months, building bunkers, digging tunnels, and setting deadly traps. The Marines knew the risks. The jungles and hedgerows provided perfect cover for enemy ambushes. The enemy's artillery, hidden just across the DMZ, could rain down on them at any time. And worst of all, the NVA would fight to the last man. Still, the Marines pressed forward. They were battle-hardened, trained for war, and ready for anything. What they didn't know was that the enemy was already waiting for them, with a plan that would lead to some of the most brutal and bloody battles of the Vietnam War. The trap was set, and soon the first shots of Operation Kingfisher would be fired. Before the sun even rose on the September 13th, 1967, war came to Con Thien. Under the cover of darkness, a full company of North Vietnamese soldiers moved silently toward the northeastern perimeter of the Marine stronghold at Con Thien. Their mission was simple: break through, overrun the base, and wipe out the Marines inside. But the Marines were ready. For weeks, they had been on high alert, knowing the enemy was close. As the first waves of NVA troops reached the perimeter, they were met with a wall of gunfire. Machine guns roared, rifles cracked, mortars exploded. The battle turned into chaos as Marines fought off wave after wave of enemy soldiers. Then came the artillery support. U.S. howitzers from nearby fire bases unleashed a devastating barrage on the attacking NVA forces. Explosions ripped through the jungle, sending dirt, shrapnel, and bodies flying. The enemy had no choice but to fall back into the darkness. The attack had failed. The NVA retreated, leaving behind dead and wounded. But the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. The attack on Con Thien was a warning, a signal that a much larger battle was about to take place. The Marines had survived the night, but Operation Kingfisher was about to turn into one of the deadliest fights of the Vietnam War. Just over a week after the failed attack on Con Thien, the Marines took the fight to the enemy. On September 21st, 1967, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 2/4, launched a sweep operation south of the DMZ, east of Con Thien. The goal? Flush out enemy forces hiding in the thick jungle and destroy them. 3 Marine companies, E, F, and G, moved through dense hedgerows, a terrain perfect for an ambush. And that's exactly what was waiting for them. Suddenly, machine guns opened fire from multiple directions. Mortars and RPGs exploded all around them. The NVA had set a perfect trap, a deadly pinwheel ambush, surrounding the Marines in a crossfire of bullets and shrapnel. The battle turned into a desperate fight for survival. Marines took cover in the mud, returning fire as best they could. But the enemy was everywhere. Snipers picked off squad leaders. Explosions shattered trees, sending deadly splinters into the air. Despite the chaos, the Marines fought back with everything they had. Close air support was called in. Jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs dangerously close to Marine positions. Helicopter gunships unleashed rockets and machine gun fire. The battlefield was on fire. By nightfall, the Marines managed to break free and fall back, but at a terrible cost. 16 Marines were killed. 118 were wounded. The NVA, who had planned the ambush perfectly, suffered about 39 confirmed dead. But their true losses remained unknown. Worst of all, 15 Marine bodies had to be left behind. A gut-wrenching reality of war. The survivors had no choice but to withdraw, leaving their fallen brothers in enemy-controlled territory. It would take weeks before they could return to recover them. This battle was a harsh lesson in the dangers of fighting in the DMZ's unforgiving terrain. The NVA were not just hiding. They were waiting, planning, and striking with deadly precision. And the worst was still to come. The night of October 14th, 1967, started like any other for the Marines of 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, stationed near the Washout Bridge, a key position between Con Thien and Strongpoint C2. But as they settled in for the night, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had other plans. At exactly 1:25 a.m., the silence was shattered. A massive artillery barrage came crashing down on the Marine positions. Explosions ripped through the night sky, throwing dirt, debris, and shrapnel in every direction. The NVA's heavy guns, positioned just across the DMZ, rained fire down for nearly an hour. softening up the Marines for what was coming next. Under the cover of the bombardment, hundreds of NVA soldiers crept forward, using the darkness to their advantage. At 2:30 a.m., they launched a full-scale assault, striking the flank of Company G with terrifying force. RPGs blasted through machine gun nests, and enemy sappers breached the perimeter. In the chaos, Company G's command post was overrun. Their company commander, platoon leaders, and forward observer were all killed, leaving the unit leaderless. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, with Marines and NVA soldiers fighting at close range with bayonets, knives, and rifle butts. But the Marines refused to break. Company F rushed in to reinforce the battered defenders. At the same time, AC-47 spooky gunships arrived overhead, spraying thousands of rounds per minute into enemy positions. The tide of the battle slowly began to turn. By 4:30 a.m., the NVA were forced to retreat. The ground was littered with bodies, both American and enemy. The Marines had held their ground, but at a devastating cost. 21 Marines were killed. 23 more were wounded. The NVA left behind 24 confirmed dead, though their true losses were likely much higher. This attack proved just how far the NVA were willing to go. They attacked in waves, took massive casualties, and kept coming. But it also proved the determination and grit of the U.S. Marines, who held the line despite being outnumbered and nearly overwhelmed. And still, Operation Kingfisher was not over. The final battles were yet to come. By late October 1967, Operation Kingfisher was nearing its final phase. The Marines had fought off wave after wave of NVA assaults, but the enemy was still out there, hiding, waiting, and ready to strike. On October 25th, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 2/4, launched a final sweep north from Con Thien along Route 561, pushing toward the DMZ. The terrain was thick with brush, making visibility difficult. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but for most of the day, no contact was made. Then as night fell, the sky lit up with fire. NVA artillery and rockets rained down on the Marines' positions, pounding them for hours. The battalion executive officer was killed, and even the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hammond, was wounded. Despite the chaos, the Marines held their ground. By October 26th, the Marines continued their advance, pushing deeper into enemy territory. As they moved forward, NVA mortar and small arms fire erupted. Helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded, but the enemy was ready. An NVA machine gun crew shot down a UH-34 transport chopper, killing the pilot and door gunner. A second helicopter was also hit, crash landing nearby. Realizing a bigger attack might be coming, Lieutenant Column John Stutt, who took over command, called for reinforcements. Company F was ordered to move in, along with 2 companies from 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. The night of October 26th to 27th was one of constant battle. The NVA probed the Marine lines, launching several ground attacks under the cover of mortar fire. The Marines fought back with machine guns, grenades, and close air support, pushing back every enemy assault. By 2 a.m. on October 27th, the enemy finally withdrew. At first light, Marines found 19 dead NVA soldiers around their perimeter, though the true number was likely much higher. The Marines suffered 8 killed and 45 wounded over the 2-day battle, but they had held the line once again. This marked the last major battle of Operation Kingfisher. The fighting had been brutal, costly, and relentless, but the Marines had stood their ground. Just days later, on October 31st, 1967, Operation Kingfisher officially ended. But the war was far from over. After 3 months of brutal combat, Operation Kingfisher officially ended on October 31st, 1967. The Marines had fought through deadly ambushes, constant artillery bombardments, and relentless NVA attacks. But what had they achieved? From a tactical perspective, the operation prevented the NVA from launching a major offensive south of the DMZ. The Marines had inflicted heavy casualties, with over 1,100 confirmed enemy dead and many more likely killed. The NVA had been pushed back, but not destroyed. From a human perspective, the cost was devastating. 340 U.S. Marines lost their lives and 1,461 were wounded. Some died in firefights, others in artillery barrages, and some were left behind on the battlefield. Their bodies recovered weeks later. The scars of Kingfisher would remain forever with those who survived. Strategically, the war continued. Even before Kingfisher ended, the Marines immediately transitioned into Operation Kentucky, another search and destroy mission in the same area. The NVA still controlled the northern jungle, and U.S. forces would have to keep fighting for every inch of ground. For the Marines who fought in Kingfisher, this battle was a test of courage, resilience, and sheer determination. They fought against overwhelming odds, never backing down despite ambushes, artillery fire, and the harsh jungle terrain. Today, we remember their bravery, their sacrifice, and their legacy. The battle may have ended, but the story of Operation Kingfisher must never be forgotten. Operation Kingfisher was led by the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, 3rd MAF, with units primarily from the 3rd Marine Division. The key battalions involved included 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines 2/4, engaged in multiple battles, including the ambush at the Trace and the night attack at Washout Bridge. 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines 3/3, reinforced 2/4 during the final sweeps of the operation. 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines 2/9, conducted search and destroy missions near the DMZ. 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines 3/9, assisted in securing Con Thien and engaging enemy forces. 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines 326, took part in defensive operations and counterattacks. The Marines relied heavily on armor and air support, including M48 Patton tanks from the 3rd Tank Battalion, LVTE amphibious vehicles, and M50 Ontos tank destroyers armed with recoilless rifles. Artillery support from the 12th Marines. Helicopter squadrons for troop transport and medical evacuation. The primary enemy force was the PAVN 324B Division, one of the most battle-hardened units in the NVA. This division included 812 Regiment, responsible for several major attacks, including the Con Thien assault. Artillery and sapper units, used to bombard Marine positions and conduct close-quarters infiltration. The NVA had the advantage of terrain and artillery support from just across the DMZ, making them a deadly and highly coordinated force. U.S. Marine casualties. Operation Kingfisher was one of the costliest battles of the Vietnam War for the U.S. Marines. Over the course of 3 months, 340 Marines were killed in action, KIA. 1,461 were wounded. Dozens were missing or left behind in enemy territory, only to be recovered later. Many Marines were lost in ambushes, night attacks, and relentless artillery bombardments. The battle at the Trace on September 21st saw 118 Marines wounded in a single day, while the October 14th attack at Washout Bridge nearly wiped out an entire company's leadership. NVA casualties. U.S. forces reported 1,117 confirmed NVA killed, body count. An estimated 1,942 additional enemy deaths from airstrikes and artillery. Only 5 enemy soldiers captured. While U.S. firepower inflicted heavy losses, the NVA continued to fight aggressively, showing no fear of high casualties, equipment, and battlefield damage. U.S. losses. At least one UH-34 helicopter was shot down, with the crew killed. Several M48 Patton tanks and armored vehicles were damaged or destroyed by RPG fire. Con Thien and nearby fire bases were shelled daily, requiring constant repair. NVA losses. Hundreds of weapons were captured from dead enemy soldiers. Multiple bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions were destroyed. The battlefield around Con Thien was left scarred and cratered, a haunting reminder of the brutal fighting. The Marines relied on search and destroy missions to find and eliminate enemy forces before they could launch large-scale attacks. Their key strategies included mobile patrols and sweeps, moving through enemy territory in large groups to locate NVA positions. Combined arms coordination. Infantry units worked alongside M48 Patton tanks, Ontos tank destroyers, and amphibious armored vehicles for added firepower. Artillery and air support. The Marines used howitzers, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships to suppress enemy positions before engaging. Fortified defenses. At outposts like Con Thien, the Marines built trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire obstacles to slow down enemy attacks. Counter-ambush tactics. Quick reaction forces were on standby to reinforce units caught in enemy traps. These tactics helped the Marines hold their ground, but the enemy was just as deadly. NVA tactics. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, and overwhelming force to wear down the Marines. Their key strategies included ambushes, luring Marines into kill zones with hidden snipers, machine guns, and RPGs. Artillery bombardment, firing hundreds of shells per day at U.S. bases from just across the DMZ. Close quarters assaults, rushing into Marine positions at night to engage in hand-to-hand combat, preventing airstrikes from being called in. Tunnel warfare, using underground bunkers and tunnels to hide troops and supplies, making them hard to locate. Sapper attacks, small enemy units infiltrated bases with explosives to destroy bunkers and weapons caches. Challenges for the Marines. Harsh terrain, thick jungle, hedgerows, and deep mud made movement slow and dangerous. Constant artillery fire. Con Thien and surrounding bases were hit by over 1,200 enemy shells per day at the peak of the battle. Difficult evacuations. Helicopters were often shot down trying to evacuate wounded Marines. Enemy reinforcements. The NVA could retreat across the DMZ, where U.S. forces couldn't follow. Mental and physical exhaustion. The Marines fought in extreme heat, heavy rain. Despite these challenges, the Marines stood their ground and fought back with everything they had. Their determination prevented the NVA from gaining control of Con Thien, but at a heavy cost. By October 31, 1967, Operation Kingfisher officially ended, but the war in the DMZ was far from over. The Marines had prevented the NVA from making a major breakthrough, but the cost was high. 340 Marines were killed, 1,461 wounded, and many more carried the physical and emotional scars of battle. The NVA suffered over 1,100 confirmed deaths, with possibly thousands more lost to artillery, airstrikes, and infantry combat. Yet despite these heavy losses, they were not defeated. As soon as Kingfisher ended, U.S. forces launched Operation Kentucky, another mission to push back the NVA in the same region. Operation Kingfisher was a brutal example of the Vietnam War's shifting tactics. The battle proved that the NVA could absorb huge casualties and still fight. They refused to retreat, even when outgunned. The U.S. reliance on firepower was not always enough. Even with tanks, artillery, and airstrikes, Marines suffered heavy losses. The war was turning into an attrition battle. Both sides were locked in a struggle where victory was measured in body counts, not territory. The siege of Con Thien became a symbol of Marine toughness, but it also showed the limits of U.S. strategy in Vietnam. Some historians believe the battle was part of Hanoi's plan to distract American forces before the Tet Offensive, which would come just months later. For the Marines who fought, Kingfisher was a test of courage, endurance, and survival. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered. Over 3 brutal months, U.S. Marines fought against overwhelming odds, facing relentless ambushes, artillery barrages, and close-quarters combat. The enemy was fierce, the terrain was unforgiving, and the cost in lives was devastating. By the time the battle ended on October 31, 1967, over 340 Marines had been killed and nearly 1,500 wounded. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, suffered massive losses, with over 1,100 confirmed dead, but they continued to fight. The war was far from over. Kingfisher showed the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of the Marines who held the line at Con Thien. Their determination prevented a major NVA breakthrough, but at a terrible cost. It was a battle of survival and endurance, proving that victory in Vietnam was never just about firepower. It was about the men on the ground, fighting for each other. Even today, the battle remains a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made by those who served. To all the veterans of Operation Kingfisher and the Vietnam War, your bravery and dedication will never be forgotten. If you found this story powerful and important, please like and subscribe to help us share more stories of heroism and sacrifice. History must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. It turned into a bloodbath. On July 2, 1967, U.S. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit known as the Walking Dead, marched into the tall grass near Con Thien, a remote outpost in Vietnam. They had no idea they were walking straight into a carefully planned North Vietnamese Army, NVA, ambush. Within minutes, gunfire and explosions ripped through their ranks. The enemy was everywhere, hidden in bunkers, dug in trenches and thick vegetation. The battle that followed became one of the deadliest engagements of the Vietnam War. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Marines fought desperately to survive. Some held their ground as their ammunition ran out. Others played dead to avoid execution. Reinforcements rushed in, but they too were slaughtered in a second ambush. By the time the battle ended, nearly an entire Marine company had been wiped out. Operation Buffalo became a symbol of both American courage and the brutal reality of war. What really happened that day? Why did so many Marines die? And how did the survivors make it out alive? This is the untold story of Operation Buffalo, where heroes were made, lives were lost, and the cost of war was paid in blood. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. This is history you won't forget. 2. The strategic importance of Con Thien. In 1967, the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ in Vietnam, was anything but peaceful. The area separating North and South Vietnam was supposed to be a buffer zone, but instead it became one of the most dangerous battlefields of the war. Con Thien, a small U.S. Marine Corps outpost near the DMZ, sat right in the middle of this chaos. The U.S. military needed Con Thien to block North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops, from flooding into South Vietnam. From this base, American forces could launch attacks, spot enemy movements, and protect key supply routes. But the NVA saw Con Thien as a threat to their plans. They wanted it wiped off the map. For months before Operation Buffalo, NVA artillery pounded Con Thien. Enemy mortars and rockets rained down daily, turning the outpost into a living nightmare. The Marines there faced constant attacks, sniper fire, and brutal trench warfare. By mid-1967, U.S. commanders knew the enemy was preparing something big. Intelligence reports showed thousands of NVA troops gathering near the DMZ, but instead of waiting to be attacked, the U.S. launched Operation Buffalo, a mission to take control of the area and crush enemy forces before they could strike. What the Marines didn't know was that the NVA was already waiting for them, hidden and ready to kill. The stage was set. The battle was about to begin. When Operation Buffalo began, both sides were prepared for a fight, but only one side knew it was coming. The United States Marine Corps believed they were launching an offensive to clear out enemy forces near Con Thien, but the North Vietnamese Army, NVM, had already set a deadly trap. United States forces, the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, led the operation. This unit had already earned a reputation for toughness, but they would soon suffer so many casualties that they became known as the Walking Dead. Reinforcements came from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, along with support from artillery, airstrikes, and naval gunfire. The U.S. also deployed F-4 Phantom jets, A-4 Skyhawks, and B-52 bombers to hammer enemy positions. North Vietnamese Army, the 324B Division, 90th Regiment of the NVA, was no ordinary force. These battle-hardened troops were skilled in ambush tactics, bunker warfare, and close-quarters combat. They were supported by hidden artillery positions across the DMZ, allowing them to strike American forces while remaining safe in North Vietnam. Unlike the U.S. Marines, the NVA had been preparing for this battle for weeks. They had dug bunkers, hidden machine gun nests, and set up deadly kill zones. They wanted the Marines to come. They wanted them to walk straight into their trap. On July 2, 1967, that trap was sprung. The bloodbath began. The battle begins. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines set out from Con Thien. Their mission was simple: patrol Highway 561, a key dirt road running through the war-torn landscape near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. The goal was to clear enemy forces and secure the area for future operations. The Marines moved cautiously, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Thick elephant grass and scattered tree lines made it hard to see ahead. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and the Marines wiped sweat from their faces as they pushed forward. Some felt uneasy. They had been in Vietnam long enough to know that when the enemy was silent, something was wrong. Then at 9:15 a.m., the silence shattered. Without warning, heavy machine gun fire and mortar rounds exploded all around them. Marines were cut down instantly as bullets tore through their ranks. Screams of wounded men filled the air. The North Vietnamese had been waiting, hidden in deep trenches and reinforced bunkers. Captain Sterling Coates, the commanding officer of Alpha Company, was killed almost immediately. With their leader down and radio signals jammed, the Marines were in chaos. They had walked straight into a kill zone, and the enemy was closing in. Some tried to return fire, but they were pinned down. Others attempted to retreat, only to find enemy forces behind them as well. They were surrounded. The trap had been set, and it had worked perfectly. For Alpha Company, the fight for survival had just begun. The NVA ambush. The Marines of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines were trapped. Machine guns, mortars, and RPGs rained down on them from all directions. Within minutes, dozens of Marines lay dead or wounded. Those who could still fight scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The enemy had the advantage. They had planned this ambush for weeks. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA 90th Regiment, had set up a near-perfect kill zone. Bunkers and trenches were hidden under thick grass, giving the enemy complete cover. Machine guns and snipers were positioned at strategic points, cutting off any escape. The Marines were being ripped apart before they even had a chance to react. The chaos of battle, with Captain Sterling Coates dead, command fell into disarray. Communications were jammed by the enemy, leaving the Marines unable to call for help. Some squads tried to advance, but they were cut down almost immediately. Others tried to retreat, only to run straight into more hidden enemy forces. Marines fought back as best they could, returning fire in short bursts, crawling through blood-soaked grass, and using the bodies of fallen comrades for cover. Some fought hand-to-hand as NVA soldiers emerged from their trenches, stabbing and shooting at point-blank range. Navy corpsmen, the battlefield medics, worked desperately to treat the wounded, often shielding dying Marines with their own bodies. Many were killed as they tried to save their brothers. Surrounded with no escape by midday, Alpha Company was nearly wiped out. Out of 140 Marines, only a handful were still able to fight. The rest were either dead, wounded, or missing. Some survivors played dead, hoping the enemy wouldn't execute them. Others made last stands, firing their last bullets before being overrun. But the battle wasn't over. Reinforcements were coming, and the NVA was ready for them too. Operation Buffalo was quickly turning into a nightmare. 6. A desperate fight for survival. The battlefield was a nightmare. Smoke and dust filled the air, mixing with the screams of the wounded and the deafening sound of gunfire. Alpha Company was almost gone. The Marines who could still fight were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. The North Vietnamese were not just attacking from a distance, they were moving in to finish the job. Fighting to the last bullet. Some Marines refused to give up. With no clear orders and no way to communicate, small groups of men fought on their own, holding their positions until the very end. They fired from bomb craters, behind the bodies of fallen comrades, and from whatever cover they could find. Many fought until their rifles were empty, then switched to grenades, knives, and even their bare hands. Lance Corporal Billy Singleton, already wounded, saw an NVA soldier advancing on him. Out of ammo, he grabbed his entrenching tool, a small shovel, and smashed the enemy soldier's skull before crawling to cover. He was one of the few to make it out alive. The heroic efforts of Navy corpsmen. The battlefield medics, known as Navy corpsmen, performed acts of pure bravery. Under heavy fire, they dragged wounded Marines to safety, used their own bodies as shields, and tried to keep their brothers alive. One corpsman, Donald McLaren, ran through enemy fire to save a wounded Marine. Just as he reached him, a bullet tore through his own body, but he refused to stop. He patched up the Marine and dragged him back to cover before collapsing from blood loss. Some played dead to survive. For many Marines, fighting wasn't an option. The NVA was executing the wounded, finishing off any Marine still moving. Some Marines, covered in the blood of their dead friends, pretended to be dead, lying motionless as enemy soldiers walked past them. One survivor later recalled watching an NBA soldier bayonet his fallen friends one by one, making sure no one was alive. He held his breath and prayed they would pass him by. By the time reinforcements were on their way, it was too late for most of Alpha Company, but the bloodshed was far from over. News of Alpha Company's destruction spread quickly. By mid-afternoon on July 2, 1967, U.S. commanders realized they had just lost an entire Marine company. They immediately ordered Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines to move in and rescue any survivors. But the NVA had planned for this too. Bravo Company moved cautiously, advancing toward the last known position of Alpha Company. They didn't know they were walking into a second ambush. The second trap. As Bravo Company approached the battlefield, NVA machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending Marines flying. Within minutes, the rescue mission turned into another slaughter. The NVA had dug deep, reinforced trenches, allowing them to fire, disappear, and move unseen. U.S. Marines tried to push forward, but every step was met with deadly resistance. One Marine, Lance Corporal James O'Connor, recalled crawling through the grass, watching his fellow Marines drop one by one. "Everywhere I looked, there were bodies," he later said. "We never saw them coming." Reinforcements keep coming. As the sun began to set, more Marine units from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines were sent in. The NVA continued to fight fiercely, refusing to retreat. By the end of the day, over 80 more Marines were dead. The battle was spiraling out of control. The U.S. needed a new plan, one that didn't involve sending more men into the enemy's kill zones. The next move would be massive. By July 3, 1967, it was clear that sending more Marines into the enemy's kill zones was suicide. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was too well dug in. Their ambushes too deadly. U.S. commanders needed to change tactics. Instead of marching more men into the trap, they decided to bring the full power of American firepower down on the enemy. Carpet bombing and artillery barrages. At dawn, the U.S. launched one of the most intense bombardments of the war. B-52 bombers carpet bombed the battlefield, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives. F-4 Phantom jets and A-4 Skyhawks unleashed napalm and cluster bombs, setting entire sections of the jungle on fire. Naval gunfire from offshore warships pounded NVA positions with heavy artillery. The ground shook as fire and explosions consumed the enemy bunkers. The NVA had dug deep, but no trench was safe from the relentless bombing. Marines launch a brutal counterattack. After hours of bombardment, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, 3/9, launched a full assault. Moving in with tanks and armored vehicles, the Marines fought trench to trench, clearing out NVA positions one by one. Many NVA soldiers, realizing they were losing, fought to the death. Others tried to retreat but were cut down by U.S. airstrikes and artillery. The battle turned into close-quarters combat, with Marines using flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets to clear bunkers. The NVA finally withdraws. After 2 days of relentless fighting, the NVA finally abandoned the battlefield, leaving behind hundreds of dead soldiers and destroyed weapons. The Marines had won the fight, but at a terrible cost. Operation Buffalo had crippled the NVA's ability to operate in the area, but the U.S. paid for it in blood. The battle was over, but the suffering had just begun. The battle was over, but the damage was done. Operation Buffalo had turned into one of the deadliest battles of the Vietnam War for U.S. Marines. The human cost. The final toll was staggering: 159 Marines killed, 345 Marines wounded, over 1,290 North Vietnamese soldiers dead. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9. The Walking Dead had been nearly wiped out. Some survivors were rescued days later, found hiding among the bodies of their fallen brothers. Others were missing, some captured, some never found. Many of the Marines who made it out alive were physically and mentally scarred forever. The horrors of the battle, the sight of friends being gunned down or executed, haunted them for the rest of their lives. What went wrong? Operation Buffalo exposed major failures in U.S. intelligence and strategy. The NVA was far more prepared than expected. Marine patrols were sent in without enough support. The enemy used superior ambush tactics, forcing Marines into deadly kill zones. Some officers later admitted that the operation should have never been carried out as planned. The Marines had been sent into a trap, and they paid the price. A costly victory. In the end, the U.S. declared Operation Buffalo a success because they had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. But for the Marines who fought there, it felt like anything but a victory. The battle proved one thing. The NVA was not afraid of fighting U.S. forces head-on, and they were willing to pay the price in blood. The war was far from over. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, had always been a tough unit, but after Operation Buffalo, they earned a new name, the Walking Dead. The nickname came from their incredibly high casualty rate throughout the Vietnam War. No other Marine unit suffered as many losses. By the end of Operation Buffalo, nearly an entire company had been wiped out. The survivors were physically and emotionally shattered. Many had watched their closest friends die in front of them. Some had barely escaped, playing dead among fallen Marines to avoid execution. The battle left deep scars on those who lived through it. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, nightmares, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for the rest of their lives. The brutality of the ambush, the sight of Marines being cut down in seconds, never left them. Despite the horrors they faced, the Marines of 19 never backed down. They continued to fight in some of the toughest battles of the war, always standing their ground no matter the odds. Their courage became legendary. Years later, veterans of the battalion gathered to honor their fallen brothers, ensuring that the sacrifices made during Operation Buffalo would never be forgotten. The Walking Dead had earned their name, but they were never truly defeated. 11th. Operation Buffalo became one of the most studied battles of the Vietnam War. It showed the bravery of U.S. Marines, but also exposed the deadly effectiveness of North Vietnamese ambush tactics. Military leaders later used it as a lesson in combat strategy, reconnaissance failures, and the cost of underestimating the enemy. For the Marines who fought there, however, it was more than just history. It was a memory that never faded. Many who survived carried the weight of what happened for the rest of their lives. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield stayed with them, haunting their dreams. Some never spoke about it. Others spent years trying to make sense of what they had lived through. Today, the men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, are honored for their sacrifice. Veterans' reunions, memorials, and books ensure that the names of the fallen are never forgotten. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., bears the names of many Marines who lost their lives in Operation Buffalo. Both American and Vietnamese veterans who fought in this battle later reflected on the cost of war. Some met decades later, not as enemies, but as soldiers who had survived the same nightmare. Operation Buffalo was a tragedy, but it also became a symbol of the courage, resilience, and sacrifice of those who fought in Vietnam. Operation Buffalo was more than just another battle in the Vietnam War. It was a test of courage, survival, and sacrifice. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, walked into a nightmare, fought with everything they had, and suffered horrific losses. Despite the ambush, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, they refused to give up. This battle exposed the brutality of the Vietnam War. It showed how deadly the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, could be and how dangerous it was to underestimate them. It also proved the unbreakable spirit of the U.S. Marines, who fought against impossible odds and never backed down. For those who survived, the memories of July 2nd to 3rd, 1967, never faded. They carried the weight of that battle for the rest of their lives. Many of them returned home to a country that didn't fully understand what they had been through. But their story matters. Their sacrifices matter. History remembers battles, but it's the people who fought them that truly define them. The men of Operation Buffalo paid a terrible price, and it's our duty to remember what they went through. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to learn about this incredible story of bravery and sacrifice. If you want to hear more untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. May 8, 1967, 3 a.m. The darkness above Con Thien explodes with light. 300 mortar rounds rain down on American Marines. The North Vietnamese are attacking from a place the Americans aren't allowed to touch, a forbidden zone, a sanctuary. For 2 years, American forces had been ordered to stay out of the DMZ. The Demilitarized Zone was supposed to be neutral ground, off limits, but the enemy didn't follow the rules. They used it as a highway, a weapons depot, a safe house. That night, 44 Marines died defending Con Thien, but their sacrifice would change everything. 10 days later, for the first time in the war, American forces would cross the line. They would enter the Forbidden Zone. They would take the fight to the enemy's sanctuary. This is the story of Operation Hickory, the first American incursion into the DMZ, 10 days that changed the Vietnam War. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying this type of content, please hit that like button and subscribe. We're working hard to reach 20,000 subscribers, and your support really helps us tell these important stories. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened in May 1967, we need to understand the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. In 1954, after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam was divided. The Geneva Accords split the country at the 17th parallel, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and between them a buffer zone, 5 kilometers on each side of the Ben Hai River, 10 kilometers total. This was the DMZ. No military forces allowed, neutral ground. That was the theory, but North Vietnam never respected it. By 1965, the DMZ had become North Vietnamese territory in everything but name. They built bunkers there, stored weapons there, moved troops through there, used it as a staging area for attacks into South Vietnam. And American forces? They had to watch. U.S. policy respected the neutrality of the DMZ, even when the enemy didn't. Marines could shoot back if fired upon from the DMZ. But they couldn't cross the line. They couldn't go in. By spring 1967, this was becoming a major problem. Just 2 miles south of the DMZ sat a small hill. The Vietnamese called it Con Thien. In English, that means Hill of Angels, or Small Mountain of Heavenly Beings. The Marines who served there had a different name for it. They called it the Meat Grinder. Con Thien wasn't much to look at. 3 small hills. The highest was only about 500 feet tall, but location is everything. From the top of Con Thien, you could see for miles, 15 kilometers east to the coast, north into North Vietnam. You could see the enemy's main infiltration routes. The Marines turned it into a firebase. Artillery, observation posts, bunkers. It became part of what they called Leatherneck Square. 4 Marine bases that formed a defensive box below the DMZ. Con Thien in the northwest, Gio Linh in the northeast, Dong Ha in the southeast, Cam Lo in the southwest. One Marine colonel explained it simply: if the enemy occupied Con Thien, he would be looking down our throats. By early 1967, the North Vietnamese army wanted Con Thien badly, and they were willing to fight for it. May 8, 1967, 3 o'clock in the morning. The Marines at Con Thien were sleeping when the bombardment started. Over 300 mortar and artillery rounds slammed into the base. Then came the ground assault. 2 North Vietnamese battalions attacked from the DMZ, about 1,200 men. They came with Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the barbed wire. They came with sappers to breach the defenses, and they came ready to die. The 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, held Con Thien that night. They fought for hours, hand to hand in some places. The North Vietnamese got inside the perimeter, but the Marines held. When the sun came up, the cost became clear. 44 Marines dead, 110 wounded. Nearly 200 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead around the perimeter. 8 were captured. The attack was repulsed. Con Thien held. But the message was clear. The North Vietnamese were using the DMZ with complete freedom, attacking from a sanctuary the Americans couldn't touch, then retreating back across the line when things got hot. Something had to change, and it did. For the first time in the war, Washington gave permission. American forces were authorized to enter the southern half of the DMZ. The Forbidden Zone was forbidden no more. Planning began immediately. This wasn't going to be a small operation. The military planners designed something massive. 4 simultaneous operations. American Marines and South Vietnamese forces working together, all kicking off on the same day. Operation Hickory was the main effort. Marines from the 3rd, 4th, 9th, and 26th regiments would advance north from Con Thien. Their mission? Push all the way to the Ben Hai River, the actual border between North and South Vietnam, then sweep back south, clearing everything in between. At the same time, the South Vietnamese 1st Division would launch Operation Lam Son 54. They would advance up Highway 1, parallel to the Marines. On the coast, Operation Bow Charger would hit the beaches. An amphibious assault by Marines from ships offshore, and Operation Belt Tight would drop more Marines by helicopter to link everything together. 4 operations, 1 goal. Clear the southern DMZ, destroy the enemy's bunkers and supply caches. Show them their sanctuary was gone. The operation was scheduled for May 18, 1967, D-Day, 10 days after the attack on Con Thien. The man in charge was Major General Bruno Hochmuth, 56 years old, a Texan, a graduate of Texas A&M, a World War II veteran who had fought at Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. He had taken command of the 3rd Marine Division just 2 months earlier. Hochmuth knew what they were up against. The North Vietnamese 324B Division, battle-hardened regulars. They had built an incredible network of bunkers and tunnels in the DMZ. Some of these fortifications had multiple rooms. They were dug into hillsides, reinforced with logs, designed to survive bombing and artillery. The North Vietnamese were good soldiers. They were fighting for their homeland, and they had been beaten before, only to come back stronger. This wasn't going to be easy. The night of May 17th, the North Vietnamese knew something was coming. They hammered every Marine base along the DMZ, rockets, mortars, artillery, all night long, trying to shake the Marines, trying to make them nervous. It didn't work. When dawn broke on May 18th, the Marines were ready. The operation began with fire. Nearly 700 artillery rounds pounded suspected enemy positions. 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns. The earth shook. Then came the jets. 4 Phantoms and A4 Skyhawks dropped 750-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs. Napalm turned the jungle into an inferno. From Con Thien, you could see the smoke rising miles away. The DMZ was burning. Then the Marines moved. 3 battalions advanced north. The 2nd Battalion, 26 Marines. The 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. Tanks rolled with them. Ontos tracked vehicles with 6 106mm recoilless rifles. This was combined arms warfare. Everything the Marines had. At the same time, helicopters carried the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines deep into the DMZ. They landed near the Ben Hai River itself, the actual border. This was the blocking force. If the North Vietnamese tried to run north, the 3/4 Marines would be waiting. For the first few hours, it went well. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines secured the hamlet of Puan. They counted 30 enemy dead, 75 bunkers destroyed. Phase 1 complete. Then at 10 a.m., the 226 Marines hit the main enemy defenses. 2 North Vietnamese battalions were dug in and waiting. Bunkers, trenches, interlocking fields of fire. These guys weren't running. They were ready to fight. The 2 9 Marines moved up to help. For the next 8 hours, the battle raged. The North Vietnamese used the terrain perfectly. Every time the Marines advanced, they hit a new bunker, a new trench line. The enemy fire was disciplined, accurate, deadly. When night fell, both sides dug in. The Marines called in everything they had. 75 airstrikes hit the bunker complex that night. Radar-guided, B-52 bombers, fighter jets, artillery fired continuously. Day 1 was over. 5 Marines dead, 142 wounded. The enemy lost at least 31 confirmed killed, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. May 19th, 5 a.m. The artillery started again. 2 hours of preparation fire. At 7 a.m., the Marines attacked. But something went wrong. Artillery rounds fell short. They hit Company F of the 2 9 Marines. Friendly fire. 3 Marines killed, 2 wounded. It's one of the terrible realities of war. Sometimes the deadliest enemy is human error. Despite this tragedy, the attack continued. By 10:30 a.m., The 226 Marines had overrun the main bunker complex. 34 more enemy soldiers killed, 9 wounded and captured. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the two 9 Marines hit another defensive position. Heavy machine gun fire, mortars. The Marines called up a tank, an M48 Patton. It rolled right up to the enemy positions and fired canister rounds, basically giant shotgun shells. The North Vietnamese position went silent. A pattern was emerging. The North Vietnamese would fight from prepared positions, well-built bunkers, good fields of fire. They would inflict casualties. But when the Marines brought up tanks and concentrated firepower, the enemy would withdraw. They would fade back, deeper into the DMZ, closer to the North Vietnamese border. This was guerrilla warfare, defense in depth. Make the Americans pay for every meter, then live to fight another day. On May 20th, reinforcements arrived. The 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines landed by helicopter northwest of Gio Linh. They swept north toward the DMZ and found something interesting. Bunkers everywhere, but not many enemy soldiers. Instead, they found supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and rice. Tons of rice. The North Vietnamese had been living in the DMZ for months, maybe years. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was infrastructure. But the fighting wasn't over. On the left flank, the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines ran into a major bunker complex. The battle lasted into May 21st. Close quarters. Brutal. 26 Marines died. 59 were wounded. They killed 36 enemy soldiers and finally cleared the position. Every bunker had to be cleared. Every cache destroyed. The heat was brutal. Temperatures over 100 degrees. Add the humidity, the weight of equipment, the constant tension. This was exhausting work. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. This wasn't the sweeping advance the commanders had hoped for. This was a grind. May 25th brought the heaviest fighting of the operation. A hill designated 117. It wasn't particularly tall, but it overlooked key terrain, and the North Vietnamese were dug in at the base. Company H of the 2nd Battalion, 26 Marines approached the hill in the afternoon. As they got close, the enemy opened fire. A full company of North Vietnamese soldiers, well-positioned, ready. Company K of the 3/4th Marines rushed to help. For the rest of the day, the 2 Marine companies made assault after assault up that hill. Each time they were pushed back. The North Vietnamese had the high ground. They had good positions, and they weren't giving up. The fighting was intense. Grenades, machine guns, small arms at close range. Marines and corpsmen were falling. The heat was unbearable. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion even without being shot. When darkness finally forced a halt, the cost was staggering. 14 Marines and Navy corpsmen dead, 92 wounded. The enemy lost about 41 killed, but they still held the hill. That night, Marine artillery pounded the hilltop. F-4 Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks made strike after strike, preparing the way for the next morning's assault. But May 26th brought another setback. A command and control helicopter was shot down by enemy anti-aircraft fire. The officers inside were wounded. The assault had to be postponed. Finally, on May 27th, E and F companies of the 226 Marines advanced to the hilltop. This time, there was no resistance. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn during the night. They had slipped away, probably back across the Ben Hai River into North Vietnam. Hill 117 was secured, but at what cost? And for how long? The Marines knew the enemy would be back. By May 26th, all the Marine units had reached the Ben Hai River. They stood on the actual border between North and South Vietnam. They had done what no American forces had done before. They had swept through the southern DMZ. Now came Phase 2, the sweep south. All forces would move together, combing the area between the Ben Hai River and Route 9, looking for any remaining enemy forces, destroying any bunkers or supplies they found. The next 2 days saw only scattered contact. A sniper here, a small patrol there. Most of the North Vietnamese forces had withdrawn, either north into North Vietnam or west into the mountains. But the Marines kept finding things. More bunkers, more ammunition, more rice. One estimate put it at over 50 tons of rice captured or destroyed, 10 tons of ammunition and weapons, evidence of extensive enemy presence. There was another problem: civilians. Thousands of Vietnamese villagers lived in the operational area. They had to be evacuated. By May 23rd, 6,000 people were at a temporary camp near Cam Lo. By the end of the operation, over 11,000 civilians had been relocated. With the civilians gone, the entire area was declared a free fire zone. Anyone remaining would be considered enemy. It was a controversial decision, but in the brutal logic of war, it made sense. No more wondering if that person in the distance was a farmer or a soldier. On May 28, 1967, Operation Hickory officially ended. 10 days. The southern half of the DMZ had been swept. The enemy's sanctuary had been violated. But this victory came with a price. 142 Marines killed in action, 896 wounded. Some of the wounded would die later. Some would lose limbs. All would carry scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. The average age was 19 or 20. Most of them had been in Vietnam for less than 6 months. They came from every state in America, farm towns and big cities, rich families and poor, all equal in the mud and blood of the DMZ. Each one of those 142 names represents a telegram delivered to a family, a mother answering the door, a father reading the words, "We regret to inform you." The South Vietnamese 1st Division lost 22 killed and 122 wounded in their parallel operation. The official American count claimed 789 North Vietnamese soldiers killed across all 4 operations. 362 in Operation Hickory itself. 37 were captured. But anyone who studied the Vietnam War knows these body counts were often inflated. The true number? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is this: 164 bunkers destroyed, 15 artillery and rocket positions eliminated, massive amounts of supplies captured or destroyed. The physical evidence of the enemy's presence was undeniable. But here's the question that haunted everyone. Was it worth it? The North Vietnamese sanctuary had been denied. Temporarily, but within weeks they were back. Building new bunkers, stockpiling new supplies. The pattern would repeat for the next 2 years. Attack, clear, withdraw, return, over and over again. This was the strategic reality of the Vietnam War. You could win every battle and still not win the war. Operation Hickory changed the rules of engagement. From May 1967 forward, American forces could operate in the southern DMZ. The forbidden zone was no longer forbidden, but the North Vietnamese adapted. They always did. They pulled back when the Americans came. They rebuilt when the Americans left, and they kept fighting. 6 weeks after Hickory ended, Operation Buffalo kicked off in the same area. On July 2, 1967, the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines walked into an ambush near a place called the Marketplace. 84 Marines died that day, the worst single day for Marines in the entire Vietnam War. The fighting around Con Thien continued through 1967 and into 1968. Operation Kingfisher, Operation Kentucky, constant combat. By the time the Marines finally left the area in 1969, over 1,400 of them had been killed at or near Con Thien. More than 9,000 wounded. The Hill of Angels earned its nickname, the Meat Grinder. General Bruno Hochmuth, the man who led the 3rd Marine Division during Operation Hickory, didn't live to see the end. On November 14, 1967, his helicopter exploded in midair and crashed near Hue. He and 5 others were killed instantly. Hochmuth was the first and only Marine Division commander ever killed in combat, the highest-ranking American officer killed in Vietnam up to that point. The McNamara Line, that ambitious plan to build a barrier across the DMZ, was never finished. The Quayson siege in early 1968 forced a diversion of resources. The physical barrier was abandoned, though electronic sensors continued to be used. Another grand strategy that failed to deliver. 3 months after Operation Hickory, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. Attacks across South Vietnam. The war escalated, and the questions grew louder back home. Operation Hickory was a turning point, but not in the way American commanders hoped. It proved you could take territory. You could destroy enemy installations. You could inflict casualties, but you couldn't break the enemy's will. The North Vietnamese were willing to accept losses that would break any Western army. They would retreat, regroup, and return. over and over. As long as it took, they were fighting for their country, their homeland. That gave them an advantage no amount of American firepower could overcome. The operation also showed the limits of conventional tactics against an unconventional enemy. The Marines were fighting a traditional war. Clear and hold. Take ground. Count bodies. The North Vietnamese were fighting a different kind of war. A war of endurance. A war of will. These are lessons that echo through military history. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The same questions appear. Can technology replace strategy? Is body count a meaningful measure of success? What is an acceptable cost? We're still trying to answer them. But beyond the strategy and tactics, beyond the debates and analysis, there are the men. The Marines who fought at Con Thien, the ones who never came home, the ones who did come home but left part of themselves in that red dirt. Today, Con Thien is quiet. It's a rubber plantation now. Peaceful. One concrete bunker still stands on top of the hill. A reminder. Locals farm the land. Tourists visit occasionally. Life goes on. But the ghosts remain. 142 names on a wall in Washington, D.C. Fathers and sons and brothers who never grew old. Their sacrifice bought 10 days of control over a strip of jungle. 10 days that changed nothing and everything. We remember them not because they won or lost. We remember them because they were asked to do an impossible job. And they did it. With courage. With sacrifice. With honor. Operation Hickory broke the barrier of the DMZ. But it couldn't break the enemy's will. In the end, that was the difference. That was the lesson. That was the tragedy. The Hill of Angels became a hill of the fallen. We remember, we honor, and we pray we learn. Thank you for watching. Your support is hugely appreciated. If you found this video informative, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. We're on our way to 20,000 subscribers, and every single one of you helps us continue telling these important stories. If you want to learn more about the Vietnam War, check out the videos on screen now. And as always, we'll see you in the next one. It began as a quiet morning in the Quayson Valley, one of those rare moments in Vietnam when the jungle felt still, almost peaceful. But within minutes, that silence was shattered by the kind of gunfire that makes your heart stop. A single Marine company, isolated, surrounded, cut off by an enemy force that outnumbered them 5-1. Men shouted for ammo. Corpsmen crawled through bullets to reach the wounded. Radio operators screamed into their handsets for help that might not arrive in time. And deep inside that chaos, those Marines realized a terrifying truth. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to survive the next 5 minutes. What was supposed to be a routine patrol turned into one of the most desperate, blood-soaked battles the Marines faced in all of Vietnam. 11 days of relentless combat, 11 days of ambushes, last stands, heroism, and sacrifice. 11 days that would carve Operation Swift into Marine Corps history forever. And today, we're going back into that valley. But before we dive into this story, a quick message to all of you legends watching. More than 90% of you aren't subscribed yet, and we are pushing hard toward our next big milestone, 20,000 subscribers. So if you love deep story-driven military history, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which forgotten Vietnam battle you want me to cover next. All right, brace yourself, because Operation Swift doesn't start with a battle. It starts with a nightmare. By the late summer of 1967, Central Vietnam had become a pressure cooker. The war was shifting, growing sharper, heavier, and far more coordinated on the enemy's side. And at the center of that shifting battlefield lay one of the most dangerous pieces of ground in the entire Vo Corps region, the Quayson Valley. To the North Vietnamese army, the valley was more than a stretch of farmland and scattered villages. It was a lifeline, a natural corridor that linked their mountain bases to the coastal lowlands, a place where troops could move, regroup, resupply, and disappear back into the jungle before American patrols ever knew they were there. For the Marines of the 1st Marine Division, however, the valley represented something entirely different, a promise and a threat. The promise was simple. If they could secure the valley, they could disrupt NVA activity for miles. They could protect nearby villages, cut supply routes, and force the enemy into the open. But the threat was that the enemy wanted this ground just as badly, and they were willing to bleed for it. Throughout 1967, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Entire battalions of the NVA 2nd Division were believed to be operating in the area. Hidden bunker networks, trenches carved into the hillsides, patrols disappearing without a trace. At night, villagers whispered of movement in the tree lines, long columns of soldiers slipping silently through the dark. The Marines could feel it too. The tension, the buildup, the unmistakable sense that something big was coming. By late August, American commanders had no doubt. The NVA was preparing for a major strike, aiming to uproot Marine positions and seize control of the valley once and for all. So the Marines responded the only way Marines know how. They prepared to hit first. Small unit patrols were ordered deeper into enemy territory. Observation posts watched the ridge lines for signs of mass troop movement. Artillery batteries stayed on high alert, and every Marine, whether he admitted it or not, felt the weight of what was brewing in the jungle. None of them, however, could have predicted what would unfold in the first days of September, how a single Marine company would step into the valley and disappear into an ambush so violent that it would drag the entire region into one of the bloodiest fights of the war. And that is where our story truly begins. In the days leading up to September 4th, the Quayson Valley felt wrong. Experienced Marines, men who had survived countless patrols, ambushes, and nighttime mortar attacks, began noticing signs that were impossible to ignore. Villagers who normally greeted patrols stayed inside their homes. Trails that were usually busy with farmers suddenly fell silent. Even the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Something was moving out there. Reports from reconnaissance teams hinted at unusual activity. Freshly dug fighting positions on the hillsides, footprints from large groups traveling at night, and the eerie discovery of abandoned camps that looked recently evacuated, as if the enemy had melted into the trees just moments before the Marines arrived. At night, the valley came alive with distant sounds, rifle bolts, quiet footsteps, whispers carried on the wind. The Marines of D Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines talked about it among themselves. No one liked to say it out loud, but they could feel it in their gut. The enemy was gathering, and not just a squad or a platoon. This felt bigger, more organized, more deliberate. Commanders sensed it too. Intel officers circled areas on the maps, pointing out where NVA forces might be massing. Patrol leaders were warned to stay sharp. The enemy was planning something, yet even with that knowledge, the valley's dangers were unpredictable. One moment the jungle was quiet, the next it exploded with gunfire. That was the Quayson Valley, a place where entire enemy battalions could move through dense brush and remain invisible until they decided to strike. So on the morning of September 4th, when D Company received orders for a routine sweep through the southern pocket of the valley, nobody thought it would ignite one of the deadliest engagements of the year. To the Marines, it was just another patrol. Another hot day under heavy gear. Another slow push through rice paddies and thick vegetation, sweating under the weight of rifles, radios, and flak jackets. But as they moved deeper into the valley, several Marines noticed something unusual. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no farmers, no movement. Even the insects seemed to fall silent. And for the men walking point, that silence felt like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Up ahead, hidden in the tree line and buried into the earth, an entire NVA force was waiting, patient, disciplined, and ready to unleash hell the moment the Marines stepped into the kill zone. D Company didn't know it yet, but they were walking straight into a trap designed to wipe them out. The first shots came so fast, so violently, that several Marines didn't even know what direction the fire was coming from. One moment, D Company was pushing through tangled vegetation. The next, the entire valley erupted around them. Automatic fire ripped through the trees. RPG screamed overhead. Mortars slammed into the ground, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Within seconds, Marines were diving for cover, shouting over the deafening roar of gunfire. D Company had walked straight into a kill zone. Enemy fire came from all sides, from hidden bunkers, camouflage, spider holes, and elevated tree lines where NVA machine gunners had perfect fields of fire. The NVA hadn't just prepared an ambush, they had engineered it. Every angle was covered, every escape route cut off, every movement exposed. Radio operators hit the ground first, pressing their antennas low as they tried to call in support. "We're surrounded. Request immediate assistance. Taking heavy fire. We need reinforcements now." Their voices cracked with urgency. This wasn't a firefight. This was survival. Marines scrambled for whatever cover they could find. A small ditch, a cluster of bamboo, a fallen tree trunk. But none of it felt safe. Bullets sliced branches above their heads. Dirt kicked up inches from their faces. Every time someone tried to move, the NVA zeroed in. A squad leader shouted, "Keep moving! Don't let them pin you down!" But movement was exactly what the enemy was waiting for. When a fire team attempted to shift positions, an RPG slammed into the ground just ahead of them, sending a shock wave through the formation. Men hit the deck hard, ears ringing, adrenaline flooding their veins. Within minutes, casualties mounted. Corpsmen sprinted through machine gun fire to reach the wounded. Rifles jammed with dirt as Marines dragged their brothers to safer positions. Ammo belts were passed from man to man like lifelines. And above it all, the enemy kept coming. The NVA force wasn't small, it wasn't scattered. It was coordinated, disciplined, and determined to crush D Company before help could arrive. Their tactics were sharp: suppress, isolate, overwhelm. For the Marines on the ground, time slowed. The air grew thicker with smoke. The jungle dimmed under the canopy of explosions, and the realization began to settle in. They might not get out of this. Back at the battalion headquarters, a company received the call no commander ever wants to hear. D Company is pinned, badly pinned. Without hesitation, a company was ordered to move, to break through enemy lines and reach the trapped Marines before the valley swallowed them whole. But they had no idea what they were walking into. No idea how strong the enemy force truly was, and no idea that they too were about to be pulled into one of the most brutal engagements of the war. For D Company, the nightmare deepened. Ammo was running low. The wounded were piling up. Enemy fire was tightening around them like a tightening noose. Still, the Marines refused to break. Machine gunners laid down bursts to buy seconds of breathing room. Grenadiers lobbed rounds into tree lines they couldn't even see. Riflemen crawled through mud to drag brothers out of exposed positions. Every Marine on that line understood the same truth. If they fell back, they would die. If they stayed still, they would die. If help didn't arrive soon, everyone would die. This wasn't just the beginning of Operation Swift. This was the moment the battle turned from strategy into a desperate fight for survival. As D Company fought to keep from being overrun, a company pushed forward through the valley, unaware that the same enemy force that had surrounded D Company was now shifting its fire toward them. The moment a company crossed the open rice paddies, the valley lit up again. Gunfire tore across the field. Rounds snapped past their helmets. Marines hit the ground instantly, returning fire as best they could. But the NVA had the advantage. They were dug in, concealed, and firing from elevated positions. Every step a company took felt like walking deeper into a storm of bullets. Still, they moved. "Keep advancing! We have to reach them!" The order echoed across the field, but each meter forward came with a price. Marines fell, hit before they could reach cover. Machine gun teams dropped their tripods and fired from the open, trying to suppress bunkers they could barely see. Radio operators begged for support, and finally, support arrived. Air power. The first jet screamed overhead, dropping ordnance so close to the Marines that they felt the heat of the explosions roll across their backs. The shock waves slammed into their chests like sledgehammers. Dirt and smoke filled the sky. Trees shattered. Bunkers blew apart. But the enemy didn't break. Moments after the bombs hit, gunfire erupted again. Just as heavy, just as disciplined. It was as if the jungle itself was fighting back. Artillery joined in next. Round after round thundered into the hillsides. Napalm streaked across the tree line in glowing waves. The valley turned into a boiling cauldron of fire and smoke. But even with all that firepower, the Marines could barely gain ground. Every time a company tried to move forward, new bursts of automatic fire pinned them down. The NVA had layers of defenses. Bunkers leading to tunnels, tunnels leading to more firing positions. It was a fortress carved into the earth. As the fight dragged on, D Company's situation grew even worse. Their perimeter was shrinking, their ammo was bleeding dry, and the enemy was getting closer. One Marine shouted, "They're trying to flank us!" Another yelled for more grenades. Corpsmen were everywhere, dragging wounded men to shallow depressions that barely counted as cover. Then came one of the most desperate moments of the day. With enemy troops closing to within just a few dozen meters, Marines called for danger close airstrikes. So close that even a slightly off-target run could kill their own men. But they had no choice. The pilots came in low, hugging the tree line, delivering their payloads with precision honed from endless practice. The blasts were deafening. The heat seared the leaves above the Marines' heads. Shrapnel rained down like metal hail. For a few precious seconds, the firing thinned, and that was all the Marines needed. Both A and D Company used the brief lull to regroup, redistribute ammo, and drag more wounded into cover. But everyone knew it was temporary. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were repositioning. A radio operator reported breathlessly, "Enemy forces are regrouping for another assault." Another assault, another wave, another chance to wipe out the men on the ground. The Marines braced themselves, tightening their grips on rifles slick with sweat and mud. Their ears rang from the explosions. Their uniforms were torn, soaked with blood. Some of it theirs, some of it not. This wasn't just combat. This was hell on earth, second by second, foot by foot. And deep within the smoke and chaos, one thought pushed every Marine forward. If they broke now, the entire valley, and everyone in it, would be lost. In the chaos of Operation Swift, with bullets slicing through the air and explosions tearing apart the jungle, something extraordinary happened. Amid the panic, fear, and smoke, the battlefield revealed the kind of courage that defies explanation. The kind that only appears when everything seems lost. And no story from that day is more powerful than the story of Chaplain Vincent Capodano. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He wasn't wearing body armor. He had nothing but his faith, his voice, and the absolute conviction that no Marine should die alone. When word reached him that Marines were trapped, wounded, and being overrun, Capodano didn't hesitate. Despite incoming fire, he sprinted toward the sound of gunshots. Not away, toward, through grass that was shredded by bullets. Across open ground where even seasoned infantrymen crawled on their stomachs. Marines shouted at him to get down, to take cover, to stay back, but he ignored them. Every time someone called out, "Corpsman," or "I'm hit," he turned and ran to them, crawling beside them, shielding them with his own body, whispering prayers, offering whatever comfort he could while rounds cracked overhead. At one point, a burst of machine gun fire tore into his arm and shoulder. He collapsed. Blood soaked through his shirt, but instead of pulling back, Capodano pushed himself to his feet and kept moving. Deeper into the firefight, deeper into the kill zone where wounded Marines were still lying exposed. Another Marine, barely conscious, later remembered seeing the chaplain approach him and thinking, "What is he doing here? He's going to get killed." He was right, but Capodano didn't care. His final act came when he spotted a wounded corpsman pinned down by an enemy machine gun. Without hesitation, Capodano ran toward him, unarmed, injured, and fully exposed, trying to reach the man before the next burst of fire. He didn't make it. Chaplain Vincent Capodano was killed just meters from the Marine he was trying to save. For his actions that day, actions that went far beyond duty, beyond courage. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But Capodano wasn't the only hero on the field. All across the valley, Marines were performing acts of bravery that would never make headlines, but would mean the difference between life and death for the men beside them. A machine gun team, low on ammo and under direct fire, refused to abandon their weapon. They held their position until reinforcements arrived, firing short, controlled bursts to keep the enemy back even as NVA troops crawled within grenade range. A young rifleman, barely 19, exposed himself to enemy fire while dragging two wounded Marines out of an open field. When asked later why he did it, he simply said, "They would have done it for me." Corpsmen raced from casualty to casualty, using their own bodies as shields while treating bleeding wounds, plugging holes with bandages in hands, refusing to stop even when shrapnel tore into their legs. Squad leaders moved through the chaos, shouting orders, pointing out targets, calming panicked Marines. Some were hit multiple times but kept directing their men until they could no longer stand. These weren't isolated moments. This was the character of the fight. Operation Swift pushed Marines to their physical and emotional limits. It was the kind of battle where survival depended not on luck, but on the men beside you, on teamwork, grit, and acts of courage that defy logic. And as reinforcements arrived and the battle expanded, those acts of bravery continued, because even though the Marines were exhausted, low on ammo, and outnumbered, they refused to break. By September 7th, the Marines had been fighting for days, and the valley still refused to give them back. Reinforcements arrived, but so did new waves of enemy fighters. The jungle, once silent and humid, had transformed into a roaring battlefield where every ridgeline, every trench, and every bunker hid danger. What began as a rescue mission had now exploded into a full-scale engagement with elements of the NVA 2nd Division. A new force enters the fight. The arrival of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 3-5, changed the tempo of the operation. These were hardened, battle-tested Marines, and their entrance signaled one thing. The fight wasn't ending. It was building. Commanders ordered coordinated assaults on suspected NVA strongpoints. The enemy wasn't just scattered. They were dug into a vast network of interconnected bunkers, tunnels, and camouflaged fighting positions. Marines advancing through the valley found themselves stepping into a maze of pre-sighted kill zones. A rifle squad would crest a small hill only to come under fire from 3 different angles. Machine gun teams would set up to cover advancing units and instantly draw fire from enemy positions hidden deep within the tree line. Every fallen tree, every mound of dirt, every shadow had the potential to erupt into violence. The bunker complexes. The NVA's bunkers were masterful works of engineering, logs thick as a man's thigh, layers of earth piled overhead, and firing slits so narrow they were nearly invisible. Marines fought tooth and nail to clear them. Grenades went in first, then rifle fire. Then fire teams charged forward, using bayonets and shotguns to finish the job in close quarters. In many cases, Marines thought they had wiped out a position, only for NVA troops to emerge from hidden tunnels behind them, firing at their flanks or throwing grenades. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a labyrinth designed to bleed attackers dry. Night attacks, the hours no one forget. As darkness fell on the September 7th, the enemy launched a ferocious nighttime counterattack. It began with whistles, eerie, chilling blasts echoing through the valley. Then came the mortar rounds, arcing overhead and exploding across the Marine positions. Shadows moved between the trees. NVA soldiers charged in small, disciplined waves, attempting to break through the perimeter. Marines fired flares into the sky, illuminating a scene that looked like something torn from a nightmare. Figures sprinting through smoke, the flash of rifles, the thump of grenades, shouts of "incoming" and "hold the line." During these night battles, distances collapsed. Some fighting happened at such close range that Marines could hear the enemy speaking, could see their silhouettes crouching in the fog of their own breath. One Marine described it later. It felt like the jungle was alive and trying to kill us. But the Marines held. They always held. The days grind. On September 8th, 9th, and 10th were a blur of violence and exhaustion. Patrols pushed into new sections of the valley, only to uncover even more fortified enemy positions. Each ridge they captured revealed another dug-in defense. Each assault took a toll, physically, mentally, emotionally. Heat and humidity drained them. Ammo ran low at the worst moments. Corpsmen worked nonstop, treating shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, burns, and shock. Still, the Marines pushed forward, because every bunker destroyed, every enemy position overrun, brought them one step closer to breaking the NVA's grip on the valley. A brutal realization. By the 10th day, commanders understood something critical. This wasn't just an ambush. This wasn't a raid. This was a major NVA operation, and Operation Swift had collided with it head-on. The Marines weren't just fighting to rescue a trapped company anymore. They were fighting to keep the entire Quayson Valley from collapsing into enemy hands. Against overwhelming odds, day after day they refused to retreat, refused to surrender ground, refused to let the enemy dictate the fight. But the battle wasn't over yet. Because although the Marines were beginning to crack the enemy's defensive shell, the turning point was still to come. By the 11th day of fighting, something in the valley had changed. The enemy was still fierce, still entrenched, still launching counterattacks with the same discipline they had from the beginning. But their movements were starting to slow. The Marines could feel it. Not confidence, not relief, but a shift. The kind that only comes after days of relentless combat where both sides have pushed themselves to the edge. And now, finally, the tide was beginning to turn. Air power takes control. From the start of Operation Swift, close air support had been vital. But as the days dragged on, the pilots became even more aggressive, dropping ordnance closer and closer to Marine positions. Strike aircraft flew so low that Marines could see the helmets of the pilots inside. And when the smoke cleared from each run, the effect was undeniable. Bunkers collapsed, tree lines shredded, entire NVA platoons scattered or wiped out. The jungle itself seemed to be disappearing under the weight of bombs, napalm, and cannon fire. What had once been a dense green maze was now a scarred battlefield, stripped of the concealment that had made the enemy nearly invincible. For the first time since September 4th, the Marines could see where the enemy was hiding. Relentless ground pressure. Air power alone couldn't win the valley. Ground troops still had to move in, identify targets, destroy tunnels, and secure every inch of terrain. This is where the Marines excelled. 3/5 and 1/5 began coordinating tighter assaults, leapfrogging between ridges, using combined fire and maneuver tactics to punch through bunker lines that would have stopped less experienced units cold. Fire teams advanced while machine gunners laid down suppressive fire. Grenadiers targeted concealed rifleman pits. Demolition teams crawled forward to destroy tunnel entrances. Every attack was deliberate, methodical, and devastating. And slowly, bunker by bunker, ridge by ridge, the NVA strongpoints began to crumble. The enemy begins to break. Reports from the front lines were unmistakable. Enemy fire was becoming less coordinated. Reinforcements were arriving slower. Abandoned weapons and equipment were being found in hastily evacuated positions. Even prisoners, rare in such a brutal fight, hinted at what commanders suspected. The NVA wasn't retreating because they wanted to. They were retreating because they had to. They had thrown everything into Operation Swift, and now they were running out of time, out of men, and out of positions to fall back to. The psychological shift for Marines who had spent days under the crushing pressure of ambushes, night attacks, and near overrun moments, this shift was powerful. They weren't invincible. They knew that. But now they could feel the enemy weakening. They could feel momentum turning in their favor. Instead of reacting to enemy movements, the Marines were driving them. Instead of being pinned down, they were pushing forward. Instead of surviving, they were taking the fight to the enemy. One platoon commander later said, "We didn't win the valley in one moment. We broke them little by little until they couldn't hold the line anymore." A hard-earned turning point. By the end of September 10th, what remained of the NVA's once formidable presence in the Quayson Valley was fractured and exhausted. They were still dangerous, still capable of ambushes and resistance, but the operational tempo had shifted. The Marines finally had room to breathe, room to reorganize, room to prepare for the final push that would drive the enemy out for good. Operation Swift had reached its turning point, but there was still one more brutal phase ahead, one that would demand every remaining ounce of strength the Marines had left. By September 11th, the Marines weren't just fighting a battle anymore. They were dismantling an entire enemy stronghold piece by piece. The turning point had passed, but the valley was still far from safe. The NVA didn't simply disappear. They faded into the terrain, using every fold of earth, every patch of brush, every hidden tunnel to delay the inevitable. What followed over the next several days was not a single dramatic clash, but a relentless grind through some of the toughest terrain and deadliest positions the Marines had faced yet. Hunting the last strong points, Marine patrols fanned out across the valley, moving methodically through fields, ridgelines, and broken forests. Their mission was clear: Find every bunker, destroy every tunnel, eliminate every remaining threat. But the NVA made them fight for every meter. Scattered pockets of resistance launched sudden bursts of fire before vanishing down escape routes. Machine gun nests popped up in places that had been quiet for days. Booby traps lay hidden beneath foliage or buried under seemingly innocent patches of dirt. A single careless step could trigger a grenade or a punji trap. A single missed movement in the tree line could become an ambush. The Marines learned to move slowly, deliberately, a balance between caution and aggression. Fire teams covered one another. Squad leaders scanned the ground with trained eyes, and corpsmen stayed close, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Tunnel warfare. One of the most difficult parts of the clearing phase was dealing with the enemy's extensive tunnel network. Some entrances were disguised as termite mounds or tree roots. Others were hidden under logs or inside destroyed huts. When a tunnel was found, Marines had two choices. 1. Send someone in. 2. Blow it apart. Neither option was comfortable. Tunnel rats, usually the smallest Marines, crawled into the darkness with only a pistol and a flashlight, unsure if they would find empty corridors, deadly traps, or an enemy soldier waiting just a few feet ahead. When demolition teams set charges, the blast would shake the ground and throw dirt into the air, collapsing entire underground chambers in a single violent moment. The deeper the Marines went, the more they realized the scale of the enemy operation. These weren't simple fighting holes. They were underground cities built to survive weeks of combat, the enemy's final pushes. Even with their lines collapsing, the NVA remained dangerous. In several areas, Marines encountered sudden, desperate counterattacks, small groups of enemy soldiers launching last-ditch efforts to break through the tightening perimeter. These weren't coordinated assaults. They were acts of stubborn resistance from units that refused to surrender the valley completely. But the Marines held every time. Superior fire discipline, communication, and overwhelming grit allowed them to repel these final bursts of violence. Each failed counterattack weakened the NVA further. A valley transformed by September 14th, the Quayson Valley no longer resembled the place where the battle had begun. Jungle had been blasted apart by artillery. Rice paddies were torn with craters. Smoke hung low in the humid air. The ground was littered with destroyed bunkers, twisted equipment, and signs of the enemy's hurried retreat. Marines walked through areas that had been near suicidal to enter just days before, now cleared, secured, and quiet. Too quiet, because beneath the relief was a heavy realization. This victory had cost them deeply. Exhaustion sets. By the time September 15 arrived, the Marines were physically drained and mentally worn down. Many hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. Their uniforms were torn, soaked, and stained with dirt and blood. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollowed by days of constant vigilance. But they had done it. The valley was no longer an NVA stronghold. The ambush that had nearly destroyed D Company had been turned into a full-scale Marine victory. And the enemy forces that had once threatened to swallow the entire region were now shattered. Operation Swift was entering its final chapter. But before anyone could rest, before anyone could celebrate, the Marines had to take stock of what they had paid for this ground with. That reckoning begins in the next section. When the smoke finally settled over the Quayson Valley and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the mountains, the Marines were left standing in a landscape forever changed. But victory in Vietnam rarely came without a price, and Operation Swift was no exception. As units regrouped, counted heads, and reported in, the staggering human cost of the battle began to emerge. Marine casualties over the course of the 11-day battle, the Marines suffered 114 killed in action, more than 300 wounded. For a single operation, those numbers were devastating. Some rifle companies had lost a quarter of their men. Others returned from the valley with only a handful of original members still standing. Individual platoons were nearly unrecognizable. The faces changed, the voices quieter, the weight of what they'd endured heavy in every expression. Corpsmen moved among the survivors, checking wounds that had been ignored during the heat of battle. Officers took silent roll calls, pausing when names went unanswered. Marines searched for friends who hadn't made it back, walking among the grass and burnt-out foliage, calling out names they knew would never be answered again. For many of them, Operation Swift wasn't just another firefight, it was the battle, the one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Enemy casualties estimates placed NVA and Viet Cong losses at 500 to 600 killed, dozens more captured or wounded. The number was significant, but what mattered more was who those casualties represented. Many belonged to elite units of the NVA 2nd Division, troops specifically trained, equipped, and positioned to challenge Marine dominance in the region. By decimating these forces, Operation Swift dealt a severe blow to NVA operations throughout central Vietnam. Enemy weapons recovered included machine guns, rocket launchers, dozens of AK-47s, mortars, maps, orders, and crucial intelligence documents. This intelligence would later help guide Marine operations in the months leading up to the Tet Offensive. Territorial gains. For all its brutality, Operation Swift achieved what it set out to do. The Marines prevented the NVA from overrunning the Quayson Valley. Enemy supply routes were disrupted. Their operational momentum was shattered. Marine positions across the region were stabilized. Swift didn't end the NVA presence. Nothing in Vietnam was ever that simple, but it forced them to abandon their planned offensive and rethink their approach in North. A quiet, heavy moment. In the days after the battle, Marines began gathering their fallen. Some were carried out on stretchers, others were loaded onto helicopters. Silent, solemn flights that cut through the humid air. Dog tags were collected. Rifles and helmets were lined up for unit memorials. Men who had fought side by side stood shoulder to shoulder again, this time in tribute. Operation Swift had ended, but its impact, its weight, its memory, would echo through the ranks of the 1st Marine Division for decades. And while the enemy had suffered greater numbers, the Marines knew one truth all too well. Every inch of ground gained in the valley had been purchased with American blood. Operation Swift was more than a rescue mission, more than a desperate stand, more than a bloody fight in a remote Vietnamese valley. It was a battle that revealed the shifting shape of the entire war. When commanders and historians look back at September 1967, they don't just see the casualties or the tactical actions. They see a moment when the North Vietnamese strategy became unmistakably clear, and when the U.S. Marines proved once again why they were considered one of the fiercest fighting forces in the world. A major NVA offensive stopped cold intelligence recovered after the battle made something absolutely clear. The NVA hadn't planned a small ambush. They had planned a major offensive, one designed to break Marine control of the Quayson Valley and push U.S. forces out of the region entirely. If D Company had been destroyed, and if reinforcements had been slowed or stopped, the NVA could have overrun outposts, cut supply lines, seized high ground overlooking Marine bases, opened a corridor for larger operations deeper into I-Corps. But Operation Swift shattered those plans. The Marines didn't just survive the initial ambush, they turned it around and smashed some of the NVA's best units in the process. The enemy's momentum was broken, and their timetable for further operations in the area was disrupted. A preview of Tet, in hindsight, Operation Swift offers a chilling preview of what was coming just a few months later. The Tet Offensive. The NVA's coordination, their use of fortified positions, their willingness to commit entire battalions to sudden, dramatic attacks, their mastery of terrain, their ability to hide large forces right under American noses. All of these elements appeared in Swift and then appeared again during Tet. Operation Swift was an early warning, a sign that the enemy was preparing something massive, something nationwide, something designed to shock American forces on every front. At the time, few understood just how big that coming storm would be. But Swift showed the shape of things to come. Marines, overmatched, outnumbered, but unbroken. Perhaps the most important takeaway from Operation Swift was what it proved about the Marines themselves. Against overwhelming numbers, a well-prepared enemy, and some of the worst terrain imaginable, small units held their ground with discipline, firepower, ingenuity, and unbreakable determination. The enemy had every advantage: surprise, preparation, terrain, yet the Marines refused to collapse. Their ability to coordinate reinforcements under fire, call in close air support with pinpoint accuracy, and launch counterattacks against fortified positions demonstrated tactical skill that few militaries on Earth could match. Operation Swift was a reminder that the U.S. Marine Corps could not be intimidated or driven out of a fight, no matter how desperate the odds. Securing the Quayson Valley. In the short term, the Marines achieved what they set out to do. The NVA's foothold was weakened, their planned offensive was derailed. The valley remained under American and ARVN control, and Marine units maintained strategic access to key terrain and supply routes. The battle didn't end enemy activity in the valley. Nothing in Vietnam was ever that permanent, but it reset the balance of power and forced the NVA to reorganize, delaying future operations. A legacy of sacrifice in the end, Operation Swift is remembered not just for its tactical importance, but for its human legacy. The courage of Marines who fought through ambushes, night attacks, bunker complexes, and overwhelming firepower. It stands as a testament to what small units can accomplish under impossible circumstances. It stands as a warning about the enemy's growing strength and preparation. And it stands as a powerful chapter in the story of the war. A chapter that reminds us that even when victory is achieved, it often comes at a cost that echoes long after the fighting ends. When the Marines finally left the Quayson Valley, they didn't march out as the same men who had gone in. The valley had changed them, carved something into them that would stay long after the war ended. They had fought 11 days of brutal, unforgiving combat. They had seen ambushes explode around them, watched friends fall beside them, and push through fear, exhaustion, and impossible odds. And still, they held their ground. Operation Swift wasn't just a battle, it was a testament to endurance, to brotherhood, to the sacrifices made far from home, in a valley most Americans had never heard of. The Marines didn't ask for glory. They didn't ask for recognition. They just did what Marines do. They stood their ground and refused to break. Today, decades later, the story of Operation Swift stands as a reminder of everything this war demanded. Courage under fire, strength in the face of overwhelming odds, and the kind of loyalty that only forms when lives depend on it. It reminds us that history isn't just made by generals and strategies, but by the young men in muddy boots, carrying rifles heavier than their fear, fighting inch by inch for the Marine beside them. And remembering them, honoring what they endured, is why we tell these stories. Before we wrap up, I want to speak directly to all of you watching. This channel is built on your support, your comments, your shares, your passion for forgotten battles and untold stories. That's what keeps these videos coming. And right now we are pushing hard toward 20,000 subscribers. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into Operation Swift, if you appreciate the research, the storytelling, and the effort behind these videos, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which Vietnam War story you want to see next. Your feedback decides the next upload. Your support grows this community, and together we keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. And above all, thank you for honoring the men who fought in battles the world must never forget. June 15th, 1966. 18 U.S. Marines find themselves trapped on a lonely hilltop deep inside enemy territory. Around them, more than 200 enemy soldiers are closing in from all sides. Their radio is failing, their ammunition is almost gone, and nearly every man is wounded. Yet, for 12 brutal hours, they refuse to surrender. This isn't a story about numbers. It's about courage, leadership, and the unbreakable bond between brothers in arms. This is the incredible last stand on Hill 488, one of the most heroic small unit battles in Marine Corps history. Deep in the jungles of central Vietnam, a single recon team was sent on a mission that seemed simple: watch and report. But what began as a routine observation mission quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. A fight where every bullet counted, every decision meant life or death, and every second mattered. By dawn, the hill was covered with bodies. 6 Marines had made the ultimate sacrifice. 12 were wounded, and yet not a single man had surrendered. This is the true story of how 18 Marines stood their ground against impossible odds, and how their courage on a lonely hill became legendary. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because over 90% of viewers who watch these forgotten battles aren't subscribed yet. Our mission is to bring you the real stories of courage, sacrifice, and strategy from history's most intense wars. Stories like Hill 488 that deserve to be remembered. And trust me, you'll want to stay with us until the very end of this video, because the final moments of this battle will leave you speechless. After the Korean War, Staff Sergeant Jimmy Howard had already proven himself in battle. By 1966, he was a veteran Marine, calm under pressure, respected by his men, and trusted with missions that required absolute discipline. That is why the Marine Corps selected him to lead a small recon team of just 18 men into the jungles of central Vietnam. Their mission was clear: climb a 488-foot hill near a small farming village called Phu Loc, observe enemy troop movements, and call in air or artillery strikes if needed. It was supposed to be a short, dangerous, but routine operation. On June 13, the team was dropped in by helicopter and established an observation post on the hill. From that rocky summit, they had a wide view of the valleys and trails below, perfect for spotting enemy movement, but terrible for protection. The hilltop offered little cover. If they were discovered, there would be nowhere to hide. At first, the mission was quiet, but within a day, Howard's men began noticing more and more enemy patrols moving nearby. They were not just passing through. The patrols were increasing in number, and they were circling closer. Howard radioed his findings and requested permission to pull back. The answer came fast and clear: hold your position. By the evening of June 14, the situation on the hill was changing fast. What had started as scattered enemy patrols was turning into something far more serious. Howard and his team could now see dozens of enemy soldiers moving in small groups through the jungle below. They were carrying weapons, digging shallow fighting positions, and setting up along the trails. It was clear they weren't just passing through. They were preparing for something. As darkness approached, Howard climbed to the highest point of the hill and scanned the area with his binoculars. Everywhere he looked, the enemy was moving. His team was not just being watched, they were being surrounded. By nightfall, intelligence suggested that 200 to 300 enemy troops were closing in. Howard sent another radio message, warning that the enemy buildup was significant and that their position was about to be attacked. But the order from command did not change. They were to stay put and continue gathering intelligence. The Marines tightened their defensive perimeter. They checked their weapons, counted their ammunition, and prepared for a fight they all knew was coming. Each man found a position behind rocks or shallow depressions in the earth. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The air grew silent as night settled over the jungle. Then, just before 10 o'clock on the night of June 15th, the silence shattered. Whistles blew. Voices shouted in the darkness. And then came the sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, rushing up the slopes of Hill 488. The battle for the hill had begun. The first wave hit with terrifying speed. More than 200 enemy soldiers charged up the slopes, shouting and firing as they came. Howard's men waited until they were close, then unleashed a storm of rifle and machine gun fire that tore through the attackers. Dozens fell in the first moments, but the enemy kept coming. They were determined to overwhelm the small Marine team by sheer numbers. The fight turned into chaos. Enemy troops crawled and sprinted through the darkness, throwing grenades and firing from every direction. The Marines shifted from target to target, moving between their shallow positions to keep the enemy guessing. Every shot had to count. Their ammunition was limited and resupply was impossible. Wounded Marines refused to fall back. Some hit multiple times, dragged themselves to better positions, and kept firing. The two Navy corpsmen worked under heavy fire, crawling through bullets and explosions to treat the injured. Communication with air support was patchy, but Howard managed to call in danger-close airstrikes, bombs and napalm falling just meters from their perimeter. It was a desperate gamble, but it slowed the enemy advance. At times, the fighting became hand-to-hand. Marines threw grenades at point-blank range. When those ran out, they hurled rocks. Anything that could stop the enemy was used. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the sounds of shouting and gunfire. Wave after wave crashed against Hill 488. Each one was beaten back, but at a terrible cost. By the middle of the night, nearly every man was wounded, ammunition was running low, and the enemy was still climbing. Yet not one Marine thought about surrender. They were holding the line, no matter what it took. By the time the first light of dawn touched the jungle on June 16th, the Marines on Hill 488 had been fighting for more than 5 hours without pause. Their ammunition was almost gone. Many had only a few rounds left, some none at all. Every man was wounded, some lightly, others barely conscious. But still, they refused to leave their positions. Howard moved from one Marine to the next, encouraging them, checking their weapons, and relaying targets to the aircraft overhead. Even with blood soaking through his uniform from multiple wounds, he stayed calm. He knew that if they could hold out just a little longer, help might reach them. The enemy was relentless. They launched new attacks just before sunrise, hoping to finish the job before American reinforcements could arrive. But the Marines fought back with everything they had left. Single rifle shots, burst from a nearly empty machine gun, even thrown grenades and stones. Howard called in another series of danger-close airstrikes, this time even closer than before. Explosions tore through enemy positions, only yards away from the Marines. It was risky. One mistake could kill them all, but it bought precious time. At around 7 in the morning, the distant thump of helicopter rotors grew louder. Reinforcements from the Marine Corps and supporting units were finally on their way. U.S. aircraft intensified their strikes around the hill, hammering enemy positions and forcing them to pull back. As the helicopters descended and Marines rushed to secure the area, the enemy began to retreat into the jungle. Hill 488 was still in American hands. The exhausted survivors had done the impossible. They had held the hill. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots faded into silence, the scene on Hill 488 told the story of what had happened there. The ground was scarred with craters and littered with spent shells. Dozens of enemy bodies lay scattered across the slopes. The Marines had held their position, but the cost had been staggering. Of the 18 men who had climbed the hill just 3 days earlier, 6 had made the ultimate sacrifice and 12 were wounded, most of them seriously. Every single man had been hit. Some had fought through multiple gunshot wounds, refusing to quit even when they could barely stand. Yet not one Marine had surrendered or abandoned his post. Enemy losses were harder to measure. American reports confirmed at least 40 enemy soldiers killed, but estimates suggested the true number was much higher, perhaps 150 to 200 dead and wounded. Their repeated attacks had failed to break the Marines' thin defensive line. The story of Hill 488 spread quickly through the ranks. Marines across Vietnam spoke of the 18-man recon team that stood against hundreds and refused to fall. Their bravery became a symbol of what the Marine Corps stood for: discipline, loyalty, and the will to fight on against impossible odds. Staff Sergeant Jimmy Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership and courage. Every member of his team received a high decoration, including multiple Navy Crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars. Today, Hill 488 is remembered as one of the most extraordinary small unit actions in Marine Corps history. It was a story not about victory or territory, but about unbreakable spirit, proof that courage can stand firm even when outnumbered 10 to 1. The story of Hill 488 is not just about a battle. It's about the unbreakable spirit of a small group of men who refused to give in, no matter the cost. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition, they stood their ground against overwhelming odds and held that barren hill. Their courage wasn't driven by orders or medals. It came from something deeper: loyalty to one another, trust in their training, and the unshakable belief that no man would be left behind. In the face of near-certain death, they chose to fight together until the very end. Today, Hill 488 remains a powerful reminder of what courage truly means. It shows us that bravery isn't about the size of your force. It's about the strength of your will. 18 Marines walked up that hill. 6 made the ultimate sacrifice, but because they refused to surrender, every one of them became part of a story that will never be forgotten. A story of brotherhood, resilience, and the will to stand firm when everything is against you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments, What do you think of the courage shown by these Marines? By the end of 1967, the body counts looked good on paper. Enemy casualties were high. American commanders told Washington the war was being won. They were wrong. Just weeks later, the Tet Offensive would shatter that illusion. And the men who had bled for Con Thien, for Operation Buffalo, for Hill 488, would watch their sacrifice get buried under the weight of a war that nobody wanted to admit was unwinnable. Their names are not in the history books, their battles are not in the movies, but they were real, and they deserved better. If this documentary reminded you of something worth remembering, share it, subscribe, and we'll keep telling the stories that history forgot. Until next time.